And so here's a couple of representations, classic representations. The one on the right is William Blake. It's one I particularly like. And Blake assimilates God with the sun and with light, right? So that's quite a common mythological idea, that God is associated with light and the day. Behold, I am with thee, and will keep thee in all places whither thou goest, and will bring thee again into this land. For I will not leave thee, until I have done that which I have spoken to thee of. And Jacob awaked out of his sleep, and he said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I knew it not. And he was afraid, which is exactly the right response, and said, How dreadful is this place! It is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. And Jacob rose up early in the morning, and took the stone that he had put for his pillows, and set it up for a pillar, and poured oil on the top of it. And that's a more important thing than you think. And we'll go into that a little bit more deeply, because up to this point in the story, there isn't anything that's really emerged to mark a sacred space, right? There's no cathedral, there's no church, there's nothing like that. But here's this idea that emerges, that you can mark the center of something, and that's important, and you mark it with a stone. And a stone's a good way to mark things that are important, because a stone is permanent, right? And we mark things with stones now, like we mark graves with stones, for example, because we want to make a memory. And to carve something into stone, to carve a stone and then to carve something into stone is to make a memory. And to use stone is to make a memory, because stone is permanent. And to set it upright is to indicate a center. And so that's what happens, and pours oil on the top of it, which is a kind of offering. And he called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city was called Luz at the first. And Jacob vowed a vow, saying, If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, then 1/10 of what I earn I will give him. I missed that. That's interesting too, because now there's a transformation of sacrifice, right? Because until that point, sacrifices had been pretty concretized. It was the burning of something. Whereas here, all of a sudden, it's the offering of productive labor per se, like a tithe, because a tithe is a form of sacrifice. And so there's an abstraction of the idea of sacrifice. Now, sacrifice, it's really important that the idea of sacrifice gets abstracted, right? Because it should be abstracted to the point where it's used the way that we use it today, which is, we make sacrifices to get ahead, and everyone understands what that means. But the sacrifices are generally some combination of psychological and practical. So we're not acting them out, we're not dramatizing them or ritualizing them. We actually act them out in the covenant that we make with the future. And we do that, well, unless we're extraordinarily impulsive and aimless in our lives and have really no conception whatsoever of the future, and are likely to sacrifice the future for the present, which is what Esau does, right? Then we make sacrifices. And you got to think, like, the idea of making sacrifices to make the future better is an extraordinarily difficult lesson to learn. It took people, God only knows how long, to learn that. Like we have no idea. It's not something that animals do easily. Chimpanzees don't store leftover meat. And neither do wolves. A wolf can eat about 30 pounds of meat in one sitting. And that's where the idea of wolfing it down comes from. They're not hiding it, saving it for later. They can't do that. So they can't sacrifice the present for the future. So this is a big deal that this happens. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about the idea of the pillar, because it's an unbelievably deep idea, and it orients us in ways that we still don't. It still orients us in ways that we don't understand. In fact, it's actually the mechanism by which we're oriented. And if it's lacking, then we become disoriented. And so I'll show you some pictures and describe them first. Okay, so first of all, there's a walled city. So let me tell you that you could think about that as an archetypal human habitation. Maybe it's a reflection of something like a fire in the middle of the plain or the forest, or the jungle for that matter, although it's kind of hard to get a fire going there. Imagine a fire ringed around with logs and perhaps ringed around with dwellings, right? So the fire's in the center, and the fire defines the center, and then as you move away from the fire, you move out into the darkness, right? So the fire is light and communion and safety, and as you move away from the fire, you move out into the darkness and what's terrifying, out beyond the perimeter. So what's beyond the perimeter is terrifying. You can feel that if you go camping somewhere that's wild. You know, you're pretty damn happy, especially if the wolves are howling, you're pretty damn happy to be sitting by the fire because you can see there, the fire keeps the animals away, and you know, if you do wander into the bush, into the darkness, then you're on alert, and you know, your predator detection systems are on alert. And so you could think about the classical human habitation as two places, one where your predator detection system isn't on alert, and another where your predator detection system is on alert. And you could think about that roughly as the distinction between explored territory and unexplored territory. And really the founding of a place is precisely, this is a lot of this I got from reading Mircea Eliade, the founding of a place is precisely the definition of an explored center set against the unexplored periphery. And you know, what's interesting about that, so you can kind of think about that with regards to the walled city, right? Everything in the wall is cosmos, and everything outside the wall is chaos. And, you know, but it also extends to the conceptual realm, because imagine that you're the master of a field of study. And so that's an interesting metaphor, because a field is a geographical metaphor, right? And if in the center of the field are those things that everyone knows really well, the axioms that everyone abides by in the field. And then as you move towards the fringes, you get towards the unknown, towards the frontier of the discipline. And as you become expert, you move from the center to the frontier. And so then you're on the border when you're a scholar, a competent scholar, you're on the border between the unexplored or the explored and the unexplored. And you're trying to further that border. So even if you're just doing this abstractly, it's the same thing. And it's a reflection of the fact that every human environment, concrete or abstract, it makes no difference, recapitulates the cosmos-chaos dichotomy or the order-chaos dichotomy. And that's why in Taoism, for example, it's the union of chaos and order that constitutes being itself, and that you stand on the border between chaos and order because that's the proper place to be. Too orderly, too much in the explored, you're not learning anything. Too much out there where the predators lurk, then you're frozen with terror. And neither of those positions are desirable. So, and that's what, you know, and so you think, and this is a concrete reality, obviously, as well as a psychological reality, there were reasons for those walls, right? Because inside the walls were all the people like us. And so that begs the question, what does it mean for people to be like us? And then outside the wall, there was all those people, because they were the worst forms of predators, because people are actually the worst forms of predators, who aren't like us. And the wall is there to draw a distinction between like us and not like us. And so, and that was a matter of life and death. You can tell that because, I mean, look at those walls. They had to build those by hand. And you know, you do see walled cities that have 3 rings of walls. So these people were terrified, but not so terrified as the people who built 3 walls. They were really terrified. And they had their reasons. So, okay, so now there's an idea that's reflected in the Jacob's Ladder story, that the center where you put the pillar is also the place where heaven and earth touch. And so that's a complicated idea. I think that you can, you know, I'm trying to look at these stories from a psychological perspective. And so then you could say that that's a symbolic place where the lowest and the highest come together. And so it's a place where earthly being stretches up to the highest possible ethical abstraction. And that's the center, because one of the things that defines us, say, as opposed to them, is that we're all united within a certain ethic. That's what makes us the same. This is a complicated line of reasoning, but I'll go back to it after I show you some more pictures. But so that's the first idea, is that the center is the place where the lowest and the highest touch simultaneously. And so you could say that in some sense it specifies the aim of a group of people. That's another way. You know, if you get together with people to make a group, even at work, you group yourself around a project, and that unites you, and it unites you because you all have the same aim. You're all pointing to the same thing. And that makes you the same in some ways, because if you're after the same thing I am, then the same things are going to be important to you that are important to me. And the same things are going to be negative to you that are negative to me, because our emotions work out that way. And that means I can instantly predict you. I know how you're going to behave. And so our aim, which is basically our ethical aim, it's because we're aiming at something better, at least in principle, we're aiming at something better. It's our ethical aim that unites our perceptions, and that's what aligns our emotions. And so that sort of begs the question, if you're going to build a community, around what aim should the community congregate? Okay, so the idea here is that the center of the community is the pillar that unites heaven and earth. So it unites the lowest with the highest. So there's some intimation of the idea that it's the highest that unites the community. Okay, and so keep that in mind. And that's a very old idea as well. That's the idea of the axis mundi, which is the center pole that unites heaven and earth. It's an unbelievably old idea, tens of thousands of years old. It might even stretch back to whatever our archaic memories, quasi-memories, I don't know what you would describe them, archetypal memories of our excessively old ancestry in trees, when the tree itself was in fact the center of the world, and that it was ringed by snakes and chaos. And so, well, we have no idea how old these ideas are, but they're very, very old. And evolution is a conservative business. Once it builds a gadget, then it builds new things on top of that gadget. It's like a medieval town, right? The center of the town is really old, and newer areas of the town get built around it, but the center is still really old, and that's what we're like. You know, our platforms, like our basic physiological structure, this skeletal body, is some tens of millions of years old, or older than that. If you think about vertebrates, it's much older than that, and that's all conserved. So everything's built on top of everything else. All right, so there's a kind of a classic town. And there's the idea, I showed you this Scandinavian world tree, same idea, it unites heaven and earth, and around the roots of that tree are snakes that eat this tree constantly. So that's the idea that there's stability, but there's constant transformation around that stability. And at the same time the snakes are gnawing on the roots, there's streams that are nourishing it. So it's sort of an echo of the idea that life depends on death and renewal constantly, because your cells are dying and being renewed constantly, right? If they are just proliferating, then you have cancer. If they're just dying, then you die. You have to get the balance between death and life exactly right so that you can actually live, which is also a very strange thing. So, and that tree is something that reaches from the bottom layers of being, maybe the microcosm, all the way to the macrocosm. That's the idea anyways. So then there's Jacob and his pillar. He's got this idea that you can mark the center with this stone. Like, it sort of symbolizes what he was laying on when he dreamt, but now he's got this idea. You put something erect and it marks the center, and it symbolizes his vision of the highest good, something like that, and the promise that's been made to him. And then this is an Egyptian obelisk, the pyramid on top of it, that's in Paris. It was taken from Luxor and put in Paris. And so that's a much more sophisticated instance of the same idea. Okay, and there was a Stone Age cultures across Eurasia that put up these huge obelisks everywhere. These huge, like the Stonehenge is a good example of that, although it's very sophisticated. And they were also markers of places. We don't know exactly what their function is, but they're very much akin to this, some permanent marker of place. There's a good one. So that's in St. Peter's, and I really like this one because you can see the echoes of Jacob's vision for the establishment of a territory there, right? You've got the obelisk in the middle, and then you've got the directions radiating from the center. And of course, St. Peter's, this is the St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, which is an absolutely unbelievable place. It's just jaw-dropping. And so there's the cathedral at the back of it, and then there's this circle of pillars that surrounds it. You can just see them a little bit on the middle left there. That goes all the way around that entire enclosure. And, you know, a very large number of people can gather there. And then, so that pillar marks the center, and that would be the center of Catholicism, essentially. That's what that represents, right? The symbolic center of Catholicism. Although you could make the case that the cathedral is the center. It doesn't really matter. They're very close together, and it's half a dozen of one and 6 of the other. And then here's another representation of the same idea, right? Is that this is why people don't like the flag to be burned, you know, because conservative people see the flag as the sacred thing that binds people together. And so they're not happy when that sacred thing is destroyed, even if it's destroyed in the name of protest, whereas the people who burn flags think, well, there are times to dramatize the idea that the center has been corrupt, and you can demonstrate that by putting it to the torch, you know, as a representation that the corrupt center now has to be burned and transformed. And the thing is, they're both right. They're both right all the time, because the center is absolutely necessary and is sacred and is almost always also corrupt and in need of reparation. That's also an archetypal idea. And that's a useful thing to know, because, you know, it's easy for young people in particular to think that, well, the world's gone to hell in a handbasket, and it's the fault of the last generation. They've left us this terrible mess, and, you know, we're feeling pretty betrayed about that, and now we have to clean it up. It's like, yeah, people have been thinking that for like 35,000 years. It's not new. And the reason it's not new is because it's always true. You know, what you're handed is a sacred center with flaws. Always, always. And it's partly because it's the creation of the dead, right? And the dead can't see and they can't communicate, and so they're not in touch with the present. And so what they've bequeathed to you, apart from the fact that it might actually be corrupt, which is a slightly different thing, is at least blind and dead. And so what the hell can you expect from something that's blind and dead? You know, you're lucky if it just doesn't stomp you out of existence. So that's a lovely photograph, obviously, and that's the establishment of a new center. And then the center can be a cathedral too, and often is, of course, in classic towns, European towns in particular, although it's not only European towns that are like this. There's a center that's made out of stone, so that would be the cathedral, and it's got the highest tower, and on top of the tower there's often a cross, and that's the symbolic center. So people are drawn together around whatever the cross represents. Now, the cross obviously represents a center, because it's an X, right? X marks the spot. So the center of the cross is the center. And then the cathedral is often in a cross shape, which also marks the center. And then in the cathedral, there's a dome often, and that's the sky, and that's that ladder that reaches from earth to heaven. So it's a recapitulation of the same idea. So, and people are drawn to that center. And the center is the symbol of what unites them, and what unites them is the faith that the cathedral is the embodiment of. And you think, well, what does the faith mean? And again, we're approaching this psychologically, and what it means is that everyone who's a member of that group accepts the transcendent ideal of the group. Now, the thing is, if you're the member of a group, you accept the transcendent ideal of the group. That's what it means to be a member of a group. So if you're in a work team and you're all working on a project, what you've essentially done is decided that you're going to make the goal unquestionable, right? I mean, you might argue about the details, but if you're tasked with something, you know, here's a job for you, 10 people, organize yourself around the job. You can argue about how you're going to do the job, but you can't argue about the job. Then the group falls apart. And so there's an act of faith in some sense. The reason that the act of faith is necessary is because it's very, very difficult to specify without error what that central aim should be, given that there's any number of aims, right? And it's a very, very difficult thing to figure out, and this is something we're going to do a little bit tonight, is like, what should the aim be around which a group would congregate? You know, so especially if it's a large group, and it's a large group that has to stay together across very large swaths of time, and the group is incredibly diverse. You know, what possible kind of ideal could unite a large group of diverse people across a very large stretch of time? That's a really, really hard question, and I think part of the way that question has been answered is it's been answered symbolically and in images, because it's so damn complicated that it's almost impossible to articulate. So, but obviously you need to have a center around which everyone can unite, because if you don't, then everyone's at odds with one another. Like if I don't know what you're up to and you don't know what he's up to, we're just strangers, and we don't know that our ethics match at all, then the probability that we're going to be able to exist harmoniously decreases rapidly to zero. And that's obviously just no good. That's a state of total chaos. So we can't have that. It's not possible to exist without a central ideal. It's not possible. And it's deeper than that. It's deeper than that, partly because I'll try to get this right. This is the sort of thing that I was arguing with Sam Harris about. You see, your category system is a product of your aims. That's the thing. Like if you have a set of facts at hand, the facts don't tell you how to categorize the facts, because there's too damn many facts. There's a trillion facts, and there's no way, without imposing some a priori order on them, of determining how it is that you should order them. So how do you order them? Well, that's easy. You decide what you're aiming at. Now, how do you do that? Well, I'm not answering that question at the moment. I'm just saying that in order to organize those facts, you need an aim. And then the aim instantly organizes the facts into those things relevant to the aim, tools, let's say, those things that get in the way, and a very large number of things that you don't have to pay attention to at all, right? It excludes, like if you're working on an engineering problem, you don't have to worry about practicing medicine in your neighborhood. You don't, there's a bunch of, like if you're focusing on a particular, what would you say? Any job, any set of skills implies that you're good at a small set of things and then not good at an incredibly large number of other skills. It simplifies things, and so you can use your aim as the basis of a category structure. And so you also have to keep that in mind, because what it means is, as far as I can tell, that what it means is that your category system itself, which is what structures your perceptions, is actually dependent on the ethics of your aim. It's a moral thing. It's directly dependent on your aim. And that's a stunning idea if it happens to be true. It's not how people think about thinking. We don't think that way. We think deterministically, let's say, or that we think empirically, or that we think rationally. And none of that appears to be the case. What we do is we posit a valid aim, and then we organize the world around the aim. And there's plenty of evidence from that in psychological studies of perception, right? That does look like how the perceptual systems work. Mostly they ignore, because the world's too complicated. They focus on a small set of phenomena deemed relevant to whatever the aim is. And then, of course, the aim is problematic. Again, it's complex, because the aim I have has to be an aim that some of you share or at least don't object to, because otherwise I'm not going to get anywhere with my damn aim. It has to actually be implementable in the world. It has to be sustainable across at least some amount of time. It can't kill me. Like, it's really hedged in, this aim. It isn't any old thing. There's hardly any things that it can be. So, you know, Jacob's aim, for example, in undermining Esau almost gets him killed. And you can understand why. That's the other thing. You think, well, that was a nasty bit of work. You can understand Esau's rage. It's, even though we're separated from the people in these stories by, 4,000 years, 3,000 years, something like that, you know immediately why everyone feels the way they do, at least once you understand the context of the story. That none of that's mysterious in the least.